Yeah, so the basic idea is that when human beings make sound, it's sort of a wide range of stuff that happens when you make sound and when you create meaning in the world. And the division between what we categorize as language versus music versus something that's neither one of those things, it's just really cultural, right? It really depends a lot on the linguistic context and also the cultural context. So to give you one very specific example, the language I do the most work on is a language called Mazatec, which, like Chinese, has tones. And there is a whistled register that so people can whistle to each other and communicate things. If this was in another cultural linguistic context, whistling would just be musical, right? It would just be sort of sounds that people are making that most people would categorize as music. In the context of this particular linguistic context and cultural context, people understand that kind of whistling as being communicating like language does, right? Communicating specific kind of messages. So that's the basic idea, is that you have to recognize that how we think about these different categories that break up the different continuum of human expression is just really dependent upon the cultural context in which they happen. So one of the things I was arguing is that so Mazatec is a widely spoken language, right? So lots of kids grow up speaking it. There's some like 200,000 people who speak it. So for an indigenous language, it's pretty widely spoken still. But still, it's kind of under threat, right? Because Spanish is so incredibly dominant in pretty much every domain you can imagine. So lots of people who are sort of activists are trying, do various things to try to promote the vitality and the importance and the sort of public nature of their languages. And one of the things that I argued when people in this particular part of the country of Mexico, people who speak Mazatec, when they tried to revitalize the language by tying it to this particular holiday, the Day of the Dead, in Mexico, and this contest that they invented, that it was really effective because that holiday has so much importance in the local community. And it was already one in which people were doing lots of kind of music making and performance and just lots of culturally important activities. It's also one of the times when people who have moved away from the region come back. It's one of the times when people spend the most money, in a given year. It's like that's when they've got extra money. That's when they spend it, where they buy presents for people. They have lots of people over to have mole. So the argument was that because it was tied to this particular holiday that was already really important, and one where people were already doing a lot of things like making music and singing and dancing and performing, that it really tied the language in a new way to things that were already really important in the community. And in particular because it had this new dimension of where people had been singing in the language or had been making music but not necessarily singing, when they invented this thing about like, hey, everybody can write songs, we can write songs. It sort of gave everybody this chance to have their like 15 minutes of fame, right? So it was kind of like fun and also competitive, but at the same time, drew on a lot of old values about honoring the ancestors and honoring families. So it was kind of both new and old all at the same time. If that makes sense. Well, I think one of the things that linguistic anthropology has only recently begun to do a lot of is to really, in the context of anthropology as a discipline, one of the things that linguistic anthropology does is pay attention to language, right, in a really conscious way. So lots of cultural anthropologists use language, but they don't necessarily think about it and analyze it very, very sort of directly, right? And that's really great, but one of the shortcomings of that is you kind of focus so much on language that you begin to lose sight of all the other things that happen around language at the same time of language, things that don't necessarily fall easily in that category between is it language, is it not language, is it language, is it music, is it language, is it performance, is it language, is it gesture, and I think taking a more holistic approach really encourages you to do what all ethnographers I think really should do, which is to really set aside your own assumptions about what is and isn't meaningful when you try to make sense of something that that you're trying to understand. And that's one of the advantages of taking a more holistic approach, is that you kind of begin to set aside your own categories and begin to try to make sense of the categories that the people that you're interacting with are using to think about what is musical, what is important music, what is beautiful music, what is good music, what is good speech, what is bad speech, what all these sort of value judgments that are really dependent upon a lot of insider knowledge. That is part of what linguistic anthropology, I think, is already doing a good job of doing, but it could do an even better job if it sort of embraced a kind of wider field of understanding what language is doing and what language can do. It's complicated because particularly when you have not just sort of two different cultures or two different languages, but you have relationships of power between the two, then it gets really complicated. So the situation you just described is not unlike the situation between a language like Spanish and a language like Mazatec, right? Where Spanish is the colonial language. That's also, in terms of its structure, is super different from Mazatec, right? Which is an indigenous language. And so at the same time, like particularly when it comes to writing, all the modern writing in Mazatec is based on Spanish phonology and Spanish alphabets and a very long tradition in Spanish of being written down. So this is one of the things that indigenous, activists really struggle with, is how do I revitalize my own language and revindicate the power of my own language when I'm using the tools of the colonizer, right? When I'm using the tools of the people who came here to stamp my language out. It's complicated. And I think, one short answer is that particularly now, these cultures are not so easily, they're just heavily intertwined, right? So it's not really possible to talk about cultural revitalization in one culture or one language without talking about how it fits into this whole big complex. But I guess the other answer I would say is that a lot of it depends on the perspective of the observer, right? What are you choosing to privilege and what are you choosing not to privilege? I think from the perspective of Mazatec intellectuals, for them, one of the most important things is just that you get people speaking Mazatec and you make it public and you give it a kind of public presence. And if you have to use some of the tools from Spanish and from Mexican national culture to do that, if it serves the greater end, then it doesn't matter so much where the tools come from. That would be one perspective. There would be other perspectives that would say something different, but I think one of the things that you're sort of pointing to is this tension between what happens in urban centers and what happens in more rural contexts. Because at least in the Americas, the urban centers tend to be the places where people have economic resources and they have an interest in doing things like activism for languages and stuff like that. But the places where people tend to speak the languages most vibrantly tend to be in rural centers that are sort of away from the cities. So there's a way in which they're kind of both dependent upon each other, and at the same time they can kind of be in tension with each other, right? Particularly when, one of the reasons that people stop speaking their language is because they move to an urban setting to get work or for education or whatever, and that provides a whole new set of possibilities for the community of speakers. They've got access to resources and they have higher levels of education, but it also poses a risk because they're not going to speak indigenous languages in urban centers. They're going to speak Spanish in most cases in Latin America. So there's a tension there, and it's important, I think, to kind of understand that it's a complex relationship. So you have to have a holistic approach again, right? You have to understand how you can't just talk in terms of like urban planning, or you can't just talk in terms of rural preservation. That this setting exists in a much more complicated whole kind of ecosystem in some sense, and that you really need to understand the nature of the whole ecosystem in order to sort of support the whole cultural construct in that sense.